In this episode, I'm going to share 3 Goatman stories I found on the internet, and one story that takes place in an area where a Goatman has been seen, but is more of an unknown cryptid or paranormal encounter. I'm pretty excited about this episode as I have wanted to tell encounters with lesser known cryptids for a while. I just haven't been able to find the stories to do so. But I finally came across a few Goatman stories that I get to share. I'm always on the lookout for stories involving lesser known and more obscure cryptids, so if you come across any you'd like to hear me tell or think would be good on this channel, send them to me. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. Alright, let's get to the stories. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who saw what she believes was a Goatman while visiting her grandmother, who lived on a reservation. They are both Native American Cree. She says the difference between her story and other stories posted in the same forum are that most of what she has read are brief encounters, but what she had to endure was being terrorized the whole night. She does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that she was 9 years old at the time. When the original poster, or OP, went to visit her grandmother, she was only supposed to stay one night. But unfortunately, a really bad storm moved in and her visit ended up lasting for 4 days. It turned out to be one of the worst storms they had had on the reservation and resulted in them losing power for 3 of those days. It was on the 3rd night of her stay that this terrifying experience took place. Her cousin was also staying with her and her grandmother during her trip, and the 3 of them were sleeping in the living room. From where the OP was lying, she could see the kitchen window, which she describes as being pretty small. During the night, she woke up to the sound of something speaking, but in a strange voice. At the time, she could not wrap her mind around it, but when she thinks back, she says it sounded like a goat trying to speak English. She is unsure what this thing was trying to say, and all she could make out was, "Hey, boys, hey." She says she got chills just typing out what she heard, even after all these years. She at first dismissed the sounds as her cousin being annoying, but then she noticed something just on the other side of the window. Standing there with huge fists against the glass was a massive figure. This being, whatever it was, then began knocking on the window, but not hard enough that it made a lot of noise. She could clearly see the outline of horns that looked similar to that of big horned goats. Fur covered what she could see of this creature, and she guesses it covered the rest of this thing's body as well. Then lightning lit up the night and she saw the creature's face. She says it's a bit hard to describe, but think Goatman, only more so like a goat. Now illuminated, she could tell the fur was mostly gray with some brown, and the creature as a whole looked old and rough. It stared through the window, which was about 6 feet off the ground, with red eyes. She estimates that this thing was about 7 to 7.5 feet tall. It remained at the window throughout the night, knocking on the glass. Every now and then it would turn and scratch before trying to speak. Its attempts at speaking eventually turned into growls and shouting. With each lightning flash, the OP could see the anger intensifying on this creature's face. Eventually, she woke up her cousin crying, and her cousin came over and laid with her until she fell asleep. This took a while because every time she closed her eyes, she could see those terrible red eyes looking back at her. When she did finally succumb to sleep, she had a nightmare about the Goatman. In her dream, the Goatman did some gruesome things to the neighbors before coming back to taunt her. Her cousin told her that she could hear it, but she could not see it. She heard the growling, scratching, knocking, and all the other noises it made. At one point, the OP went into another room and looked out the window. This is when she saw the creature in full before it noticed her. She then ran back to the living room. The next morning, they went outside and found hoof prints leading from window to window with scratch marks on all the windows. The hoof prints, according to the OP, were the size of 2 open hands placed side by side. In her research of cryptids, she has read many accounts, but says nothing comes close to what she went through that night. She has seen a lot of things, including a dogman, but nothing was as scary as her encounter with the Goatman. Around the same time, there were some other incidents in the area, including a Goatman terrorizing some kids on another reservation. She ends up saying it is messed up how there are things that exist in this world that we don't know about, and it boggles her mind. She isn't so much seeking answers about what she saw because she is certain it was a Goatman, but does encourage others to share their stories. The OP had another story that she had heard growing up, which she replied to a commenter with. It is a story she heard about a Goatman taking place on another reservation. She again does not say where the story took place. According to the account she heard, a group of young people were out drinking one night when they were followed by something while walking home. When they noticed this thing following them, the creature's behavior became erratic. It jumped up onto the rooftop of a home before leaping from house to house. Apparently, it was a very well-known story that no one denied. The reservation where it took place was known for attracting negative spirits due to the amount of drugs and violence. It is also a hotspot for Sasquatch. What a terrifying experience that must have been, to be laying there at night trying to sleep only to see a massive figure at the window. And from how she describes it, this thing was either trying to get inside or draw someone out of the home. I'm leaning more toward the latter because if this thing was as big as she says, it seems to me that it could have broken the windows if it wanted to. But to go out the next morning and see hoofprints leading to all the windows and scratches on them, that would have been unnerving. I'm glad this thing wasn't able to get inside the house and it eventually moved on. The next story comes from Sweden. The original poster does not say exactly where they were when their encounter took place. He wastes no time getting into his story because he is eager to get some opinions about what it was he and his father saw that night. His story begins at around 5 p.m. when it was already dark outside. He and his father had gone for a walk in the forest as they normally did, no more than 10 minutes from the nearest town. There were no lights on the trail with no streetlights, and they did not take a flashlight with them. They could still see the trail though and were engaged in idle chit-chat when their path led them by a lake. A group of about 50 ducks were swimming in the water close to shore. That's when they saw movement about 25 meters down the trail in front of them as something big dashed from right to left toward the lake. They only caught a glimpse of it before it disappeared from sight. The OP describes the creature as being about 150 centimeters or approximately 5 feet tall while on all fours. Its front legs looked to be much longer than its back legs, like they were arms instead of legs. He says it was like a bipedal creature trying to run on all fours. It was either beige or brown and moved with inhuman speed, making no noise while it ran. Just after it disappeared into the trees on the left side of the trail, the ducks went crazy and flew away while calling out in fear. He notes that this seemed like weird behavior if the creature he and his father saw was just a deer or something else. The appearance of the creature was followed by a heavy scent of iron and blood, which hung heavy in the air. Both the OP and his father could smell it. Even though the OP worked in a hospital and often dealt with blood, he had never smelled anything like this stench before. He has always kept an open mind and is fascinated by the possibility of the unknown, whether it be cryptids or otherwise. But his father is a hardcore skeptic, realist, and science-loving man. He grew up on a farm in the middle of a forest in Sweden and is very familiar with the country's wildlife. Even he said he has never seen anything like what they saw that night. Nothing he could think of could match the shape or run as fast as this creature did. They don't have any animals in Sweden that big, and the closest would be a deer. But they don't normally come that close to humans, and they definitely don't run that fast. Besides, all of their legs are roughly the same length, and what they saw had an upper body that was clearly much larger than its back half, with its front legs or arms being longer than its hind legs. The OP put Goatman in the title because of the iron smell that followed the creature's appearance. He says that's straight out of the legends he has heard about the creature. The experience shocked him and he had trouble processing it, so he posted his story online for input, opinions, and ideas about what people think he might have seen: animal, human, or something else. He ends his post by saying he's going back out the next day to check for tracks, but unfortunately there are no edits or updates to his story. His account was also deleted, so I can't check to see if he posted anything else about his run-in with this creature. I'll be the first to admit that I am not as up to speed about Goatman as I am with other cryptids. There aren't a lot of stories posted about the creature, so I can't say for sure if the smell of iron and blood is a common occurrence with this being. One commenter suggested that it could have been a dogman, but people don't normally describe the stench accompanying the creature as smelling like the OP describes during his encounter. What do you think he and his father saw that night? Goatman or something else? The next story comes from a poster who is relaying his father's encounter with a perceived Goatman in the West Plains of Missouri. The original poster does admit that his father was not known for telling the truth and outright lying due to his drug use, so he wasn't sure if he believed the story. But after reading up on Goatman and finding other stories online, he says a lot of the small details of this story coincided with those he found, and they started adding up. His father and his two friends were at the OP's aunt and uncle's house for a bonfire. His aunt and uncle lived in a trailer with a barn on their property about 600 feet away from their home. They were in the barn where they had the fire going when they heard, out of nowhere, what sounded like something charging. It was loud enough that his father describes it as sounding like a stampede. The creature then ran right up to them in the barn and stood in the light of the fire. His father describes it as being about 6.5 feet tall, having matted fur and a goat's head with horns and walking bipedal on hooves. It smelled terrible as it stood there staring at them, salivating. This went on for a few minutes that felt more like an eternity to the OP's father and his friends. They sat there frozen in place, staring at this thing. Then, this being took off running back into the woods about 700 to 1,000 feet from the trailer. This is when the OP says the story gets really freaky, because his cousin, who lived in the trailer, had a nightmare where she says something was tapping on her window. She went over and opened the blinds to see a goat-like monster standing there, breathing heavily and salivating before she woke up. Growing up, the OP's father always told him his encounter took place in the Mark Twain National Forest. Perhaps he did this so his son wouldn't be scared to go to his aunt and uncle's house, or for other reasons. But he recently came clean about where the events actually took place, and when the OP links it to his cousin's nightmare, it sent a cold shiver down his spine. He points out that the smaller details of other accounts point to the legitimacy of his father's story. The strong smell, that it goes after children and his cousin being in the 7th or 8th grade at the time of her nightmare, and these things hanging around graveyards. There was a graveyard about a mile from where his father encountered this creature. It was one thing after another that was too much to be a coincidence. The OP has since gone down the rabbit hole and wants to see a Goatman for himself. He has become somewhat obsessed with Goatman stories, his father's encounter, which took place approximately 20 years at the time of this posting, and his cousin's nightmare, which happened approximately 16 years prior to him telling his story. He asked at the end of the post if anyone can provide further information. I'll again admit that I'm not as knowledgeable of Goatman as I am about other cryptids, but I do know one thing: you shouldn't go looking for these creatures. I would definitely advise against that. I know some people have told stories about positive encounters with cryptids, especially Sasquatch, but there are just too many where these things become aggressive, whether it's because they were seen or just guarding their territory. We know next to nothing about them and don't know what they might actually do if confronted. Plus, from what I have heard about Goatmen, they are extremely aggressive. As for his father's story, I know he has found some things online that coincide with the story and add legitimacy to it, but I would still take it with a grain of salt, given his past of drug use and lying. However, the nightmare his cousin had does make me think it could be related. Maybe she thought she was dreaming when she was actually awake, and that's the only way she could process what she saw. What do you think about the father's encounter, the cousin's nightmare, and them being linked? Also, what do you think about going out looking for cryptids? The final story of this episode is more of an unknown encounter with what could have been a cryptid or a paranormal entity. It takes place in an area that is supposedly haunted but is also known for cryptid sightings. I included it in this episode because I could only find 3 Goatman stories, and the area where this story takes place has had Goatman encounters. The story comes to us from East Texas and takes place on Stagecoach Road. Stagecoach Road is an old road that dates back to the Civil War and was used to transport goods and other cargo from one town to another. It is supposedly haunted by apparitions of soldiers, as well as being linked to appearances of the devil, Sasquatch, and Goatman. The original poster was hanging out with friends one night when they all decided to head over to Stagecoach Road. It was usually day when the OP went down this road, so he didn't believe it was haunted. The only thing he had ever experienced while being there at night was pressure, but he attributed that to his fear of the dark dirt road. When they arrived at the supposedly haunted location, they walked around talking and vaping while his cousin suggested they go down to the haunted bridge. The OP called shotgun because his friend drove his truck there and he didn't want to get stuck riding in the back of the cab. He was also afraid to go to the bridge but hid that from the rest of the group for fear of being made fun of. On the way, his cousin stuck his head out the window and yelled, "Where's the ghost at? Y'all can't touch us." The OP told him to chill out and, to his surprise, his cousin stopped. They arrived at the bridge, which was old and unsafe, when his cousin, ever the instigator, got the bright idea to turn off the truck's lights and wait. So they did just that, and not long after, the OP started feeling a pressure and immediately did not want to be there anymore. He asked if anyone felt it, but no one else did. He then asked if they could leave because he felt uncomfortable. So his friend turned the truck around and started heading back the way they came. As they were nearing the highway and about to leave Stagecoach Road behind, his friend decided he wanted to drive around a little bit longer. They once again arrived at the bridge, but this time they did not stop. This is where the story takes a scary turn. The OP says he has never seen anything like it and notes that there was no rain, wind, or animals in sight. As they were passing a tree, a branch about 3 feet long flies out from behind the tree and out onto the road. The driver guns it and speeds down the road, which is ill-advised because the road has many holes and rough terrain. But the group was in shock and they just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. The OP's other friend, sitting in the back seat with his cousin, said something was coming up behind them and it was approaching fast. His cousin turned to look, but that was when the friend said, "No, don't. I don't think it wants us to look." They eventually made it off Stagecoach Road and onto another road with homes and a church nearby, when the driver decided to shift to neutral and rev the engine really loud. The OP asked him why he was doing that, and he responded that he wasn't. They were really freaked out by this point and pulled over to check the truck. This is when his cousin screams and points to the back window right beside where he had been sitting. There were handprints on the glass. They were the size of a child's hand and clearly imprinted on the window. Everyone could see them. No one had been back there throughout the night or touched the window. They quickly got back into the truck and drove to a gas station in town. They were all confused by what could have left the handprints on the window, as none of them had hands even close to being that small or covered in dirt. The OP has not gone back to Stagecoach Road since, and he doesn't think he ever will, because whatever was on that road wanted them to know it was there. One commenter said Stagecoach Road is one of the most haunted stretches of road in Texas, and also states that they were lucky not to crash driving such high speeds on treacherous terrain. He also says the Goatman that is supposedly there does not like it when people mess around at the bridge at night. The whole ordeal must have been scary, but to find handprints on the window afterward would have been terrifying. And for them to be too small to match anyone's hands that was with them? even scarier. As for what made them, most cryptids are described as being huge with even bigger hands. There are some that are smaller with tinier dimensions, so could it have been a smaller cryptid or a ghostly apparition? Also, another thought I had while reading this was when the prints were placed on the glass. Something big enough to throw a branch that big into the road like that and chase the car, I think would have had hands much too large to make those prints, especially as small as they were. But that would mean it would have done so while chasing them, which I think would have been noticeable, especially to the boys in the back seat. I think whatever touched the glass did so while they were parked at the bridge. What do you think? And what do you think threw the branch and chased them? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.